What if I told you that Ferrari built a race car so devastatingly fast and so utterly dominant in its raw potential that racing officials literally rewrote the rulebook just to stop it? This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the golden era of endurance racing. If you're someone who loves the untold, gritty stories of motorsport's most dangerous machines, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Here's the thing about the late 1960s and early 1970s in motorsport. It was the Wild West. Picture this. It's March 1970 at Sebring International Raceway. The air is thick with that heavy Florida humidity and the stinging scent of burnt racing fuel. You've got an army of Porsche 917s lining up against just a handful of Ferrari 512S prototypes. The Germans brought an absolute armada. Ferrari? They brought a revolution. What happens next will force the most powerful men in motorsport to completely restructure endurance racing effectively immediately. Now, to understand why the Ferrari 512S became the most feared machine in endurance racing history, we need to rewind a little bit. We need to travel back to 1968. The World Sportscar Championship was in absolute chaos. Ford had just spent years humiliating Ferrari at Le Mans with the GT40. Porsche was steadily climbing the ranks with increasingly sophisticated prototypes, and Enzo Ferrari, look, he was furious. The FIA had just announced new regulations for the 1970 season. Group 5 sports cars could now run massive 5.0-liter engines, provided the manufacturers built at least 25 examples. This was supposed to be impossible for small companies like Ferrari. Building 25 copies of a full-blooded race car? The development costs alone would bankrupt most racing departments. The FIA genuinely thought they were creating a class for detuned production cars, maybe for some gentleman racers with incredibly deep pockets. But they severely underestimated both Ferrari's pure, unadulterated rage and Porsche's ambition. Porsche moved first. By April 1969, they shocked the world by showing 25 fully built Porsche 917s to the FIA inspectors. These weren't street cars with roll cages. These were purpose-built 4.5-liter flat 12 monsters wrapped in fiberglass and aluminum. Ferry Porsche had essentially bet the entire company on this project, spending roughly 20 million Deutschmarks, which is about $50 million in today's money, just to build these 25 cars. But this is where it gets really interesting. While the press was fawning over Porsche's audacious flex, deep in Maranello, Enzo Ferrari was orchestrating something far more sinister. He didn't just want to beat Porsche, he wanted to absolutely obliterate them. And he had a brand new secret weapon, Fiat's checkbook. In 1969, Ferrari sold 50% of his company to Fiat. Suddenly, this small Maranello operation had access to resources Enzo had only ever dreamed of. He could finally build the race car that existed in his wildest nightmares. Unlimited by budget, completely unrestricted by compromise. The Ferrari 512S wasn't just a response to the Porsche 917, it was a declaration of war. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so it was a fast Ferrari. What's the big deal? Let me explain what made this machine so revolutionary that it literally broke the sport. At the heart of the 512S was Ferrari's Type 512 engine. This wasn't some souped-up production motor. This was a pure, unadulterated racing engine, a 60-degree V12 that traced its DNA straight back to Ferrari's Can-Am experiments. The specs were mind-bending for 1970. Displacement came in at exactly 4,993 cc. It had a massive compression ratio of 11.5 to 1, fed by Lucas indirect fuel injection that precisely metered fuel to each cylinder. At 8,500 RPM, this naturally aspirated masterpiece was throwing down 550 horsepower. Let that number sink in. 550 horses from a naturally aspirated engine over half a century ago. Here's what most people don't realize. The real genius wasn't just a peak power, it was how that power was delivered to the ground. Peak torque arrived at a screaming 7,000 RPM, offering roughly 420 pound-feet of twist. While the Porsche 917's flat 12 was famous for being a brutal, terrifying hammer, the Ferrari V12 was a scalpel. It was linear, progressive, and controllable. Drivers could place the car with millimeter precision while wringing out every last ounce of performance. Think of it like the difference between swinging a sledgehammer blindfolded and wielding a perfectly balanced broadsword. The chassis was just as wild. Ferrari used a semi-monocoque design made from aluminum alloy sheets riveted to a tubular steel frame. At just over 1,800 pounds dry, the 512S was astonishingly light. And the aerodynamics? A total quantum leap. While the early Porsche 917s suffered from terrifying high-speed instability, literally lifting off the ground at speed, the Ferrari 512S was born stable. The long-tail version could hit 211 miles per hour on the Mulsanne Straight, from a car designed to race for 24 hours straight. Every curve, every vent, every surface of its handcrafted fiberglass body had a specific aerodynamic purpose. It wasn't just a car, it was a guided missile with a steering wheel. Because of this unlimited budget, the 512S evolved at a terrifying pace throughout 1970. The original short-tail version quickly gave way to the long-tail 512M, the Modificata. The bodywork became increasingly extreme. The tail stretched further out back, the nose dropped impossibly low to the tarmac, and massive side radiators appeared. Each modification extracted just another few miles per hour, another agonizing tenth of a second per lap. At the Targa Florio, Ferrari showed up with a special lightweight version featuring plastic windows and a completely stripped interior. It weighed barely 1,750 pounds. At the Nürburgring, they were secretly testing active aerodynamics decades before such systems became commonplace on modern hypercars. The rear wing angle could literally be adjusted by the driver from inside the cockpit. It was highly illegal, but nobody could prove it during the frantic pace of the race. The on-track battles between the 512S and the 917 became the stuff of legend. At Brands Hatch, Pedro Rodriguez in a 917 and Jackie Ickx in a 512S exchanged the lead 23 times in the first hour alone. Their lap times were separated by microscopic hundredths of a second. Both of these guys were lapping the entire GT field every 8 laps. It wasn't traditional endurance racing anymore. It was a vicious, private war between two massive manufacturers with unlimited resources playing out on a public stage. And the human cost was mounting too. These speeds were vastly beyond what most historic circuits were designed to handle. Safety barriers that were mathematically calculated for 150 mile-per-hour impacts were suddenly facing the very real threat of 200 mile-per-hour crashes. The medical facilities at most of these tracks were severely under-equipped, and officials were overwhelmed just thinking about the potential consequences. The drivers themselves were being pushed way beyond normal physical human limits. We're talking about heart rates exceeding 180 beats per minute for hours on end. The G-forces in the long, sweeping corners were causing temporary tunnel vision. The concentration levels required to keep these monsters on the tarmac simply couldn't be sustained safely over standard endurance racing distances. Let me give you some specific, terrifying examples that show just how insane things had become. During the 1970 Le Mans test weekend, a Ferrari 512S driven by Jackie Ickx was clocked at a top speed of 362 kilometers per hour on the Mulsanne Straight. That is 225 miles per hour on a public road. A road that was normally limited to 90 kilometers per hour for regular civilian traffic. The kinetic energy involved at that speed was roughly equivalent to a small aircraft impact. To cope with this, the cars were destroying themselves. The brakes were being pushed so far beyond their design limits it was comical. The 512S used massive ventilated disc brakes all around, 11.8 inches up front and 11.5 in the rear. These were gigantic for the era, but even with advanced Girling calipers and top-tier competition pads, they were barely adequate. Brake changes during the 24-hour races became routine. And I don't mean just swapping pads, I mean completely ripping off the burning hot rotors and calipers and replacing the entire assembly in the pits. The heat generated under heavy braking from 220 miles per hour was literally melting the aluminum in the wheel hubs. Then the transmissions started grenading themselves. The Ferrari Type 512 5-speed gearbox was an absolute masterpiece of engineering, built with specially heat-treated gears and heavily reinforced casings. It was engineered to handle 450 horsepower reliably all day long. The problem? The racing engines were putting out 550 horsepower on a conservative tune, and some teams were seeing 580 horsepower with aggressive, rich fuel mapping. Gearboxes that were supposed to last a full grueling season were being completely rebuilt after every single race. And don't even get me started on the tires. Firestone and Goodyear were locked in their own vicious proxy war, desperately trying to develop rubber compounds that could handle the incredible shear forces. The 512S ran 11-inch wide front wheels and massive 14-inch rears. The tires were being subjected to sustained temperatures exceeding 250 degrees Celsius. Punctures at maximum velocity weren't just a minor setback, they were potentially fatal. When a massive rear tire let go at 200 miles per hour, the car didn't just spin out. The massive rubber tread would grab the fiberglass bodywork and act like a pole vault. The car became airborne. This was the razor's edge they were living on every single lap. The cars had officially outgrown the sport. But the FIA didn't just ban the car. They engineered a bureaucratic assassination that made the 512S illegal overnight. Here's the thing about the Ferrari 512S that most people completely misunderstand. It wasn't actually banned in the traditional sense of the word. There was never an official decree from Paris stating, "The Ferrari 512S is hereby prohibited from competition." What actually happened behind closed doors was far more insidious, far more calculated, and ultimately far more effective. The FIA looked at the trajectory of the 1970 and 1971 seasons with absolute growing horror. The speeds were out of control, the costs were astronomical, and the racing had mutated into an exclusive two-horse show that smaller manufacturers couldn't even dream of entering. The sport was eating itself alive. Something had to be done, and it had to be done immediately to stop the bleeding. So, for the 1972 season, the FIA implemented what appeared on paper to be a very simple rule change. Now, you might be thinking they probably just added a heavy weight penalty or mandated restrictive air intake plates, right? Wrong. They launched a surgical strike aimed directly at the heart of the 512S and the 917. The new Group 5 sports car regulations mandated that engine displacement would be strictly limited to 3.0 liters, not 5.0 liters. 3. Just like that, with the stroke of a pen, the Ferrari 512S and his German rival were legislated completely out of existence. It's like telling an Olympic powerlifter they can only compete if they suddenly shrink by 2 feet and lose 100 pounds of muscle mass. It fundamentally broke the architecture of the machine. Ferrari couldn't simply detune their massive V12 monster to 3 liters. The entire engine block, the stroke, the packaging, everything was designed around displacing 5 liters of air and fuel. But wait, this is where it gets really interesting. The FIA didn't stop there. They wanted to drive a stake through the heart of the unlimited prototype era. They also mandated that for a car to be homologated in the new Group 5 category, manufacturers had to build not just 25 examples, but 50. And here is the absolute kicker. These couldn't be barely functional fiberglass shells parked in some dusty warehouse. They had to be complete, road-legal cars available for sale to the general public. The FIA inspectors were going to verify not just their existence, but their everyday functionality on public roads. This 1-2 punch killed the 512S more effectively than any outright ban ever could have. Ferrari was cornered. The development cost to engineer a brand new 3-liter engine, cram it into a new prototype chassis, and then build 50 road-going versions of a car that had absolutely no real-world market, it would be astronomical. The 512S was dead, murdered by bureaucracy. Look, Enzo Ferrari was not a man who took defeat lightly. He desperately tried to keep the spirit of the 512S alive in other series to justify the massive sunk costs. They packed up the cars and entered them in the North American Can-Am Championship, a series famous for having virtually zero restrictions on engine displacements. But without the global prestige of Le Mans and the World Sportscar Championship, it was a completely hollow victory. The car that was literally too fast and too advanced for European endurance racing suddenly found itself in a brutal American series where being fast in a straight line was essentially the only thing that mattered. The irony was delicious, but it was incredibly bitter for the engineers in Maranello. The absolute last competitive outing for a factory-backed Ferrari 512S came at the 1971 Kyalami 9 Hours down in South Africa. Running in the twilight of the fading 5-liter formula, the car was completely unleashed. It dominated the field, leading from flag to flag. But everyone in the paddock knew the truth. It was a high-speed funeral procession disguised as a victory lap. When that checkered flight dropped, they all knew this was goodbye. Think about the sheer magnitude of that for a second. Ferrari had created a machine so capable, so utterly dominant in its raw potential, that the global governing body of international motorsport restructured the entire sport just to stop it. Not because it broke the rules, it followed them to the letter. Not because it was inherently flawed, but because it represented the logical, terrifying endpoint of unlimited development. The 512S was too good for its own good. Here's what most people don't realize about the business side of this bureaucratic assassination. The financial impact was absolutely staggering. Ferrari had invested the equivalent of $30 million in today's money just developing the 512S. They had meticulously built 25 complex chassis, plus enough spare components to essentially build another dozen cars from scratch. The racing program itself was burning through $15 million a year to run. Logistics, mechanics, endless testing. When those regulations changed, all of that investment became completely worthless overnight. You couldn't convert a 512S to meet the new 3-liter rules. The chassis dimensions were wrong, the weight distribution was built entirely around that heavy 5-liter lump. You couldn't sell them to private-tier customers for any meaningful competition because there was no global championship left that would allow them to race competitively against modern machinery. It instantly became a $30 million dinosaur, forced into extinction before it even had the chance to fully evolve. Enzo Ferrari himself considered it one of his greatest achievements, but also his greatest frustration. It was a car that definitively proved Ferrari could build anything, but also painfully proved that sometimes being the absolute best meant you were going to be banned. But here is the most shocking truth about the outright assassination of the Ferrari 512S. It actually worked. Look, it's incredibly easy to look back at the FIA's heavy-handed rule change as a massive tragedy for motorsport. It feels like the governing body stepping in and actively destroying a mechanical masterpiece just because they were scared of its potential. But if we are being completely honest, the 1972 season saw the immediate rise of the 3-liter prototypes, and it quite literally saved endurance racing from a total, irreversible financial collapse. Almost overnight, the grid was completely transformed. Suddenly, you had cars like the lightweight, nimble Ferrari 312 PB, the high-revving Alfa Romeo Tipo 33, and the glorious Matra Simca MS 670. These machines were still incredibly fast, and they were still technologically advanced, but crucially, they were achievable. Smaller, independent teams could actually afford to purchase, run, and maintain them without bankrupting themselves. The sport that had been rapidly hurtling toward an exclusive, billionaire-level two-manufacturer monopoly suddenly had 5 or 6 highly capable teams that could legitimately fight for the overall win on any given Sunday. Now, you might be thinking, okay, sure, it was cheaper for the teams, but didn't they completely ruin the spectacle for the fans? Didn't the racing get boring without those 220-mile-per-hour monsters? Here's what most people don't realize. Making the cars objectively slower actually made the racing exponentially better. Yes, the lap times at Le Mans plummeted. The new 3-liter cars were lapping the Circuit de la Sarthe nearly 20 seconds slower than the 512S had the year before. Top speeds on the massive Mulsanne Straight fell by a drastic 30 miles per hour. But instead of 2 overpowered cars checking out, breaking down, or lapping the entire field every hour, you had actual prolonged dogfights. The 1972 Le Mans saw one of the tightest, most strategic races in the history of the event. The 1973 Targa Floria was pure chaos in the best way possible, featuring 7 different race leaders throughout the grueling event. The World Sportscar Championship went down to the absolute final nail-biting race of the season in 1972, 1973, and 1974. It's like taking 2 heavyweight boxers who are just swinging wildly for a one-punch knockout and replacing them with a ring full of agile middleweights who trade highly technical, lightning-fast blows for 12 straight rounds. The sheer, terrifying awe of the one-hit knockout might be gone, but the actual sport itself is undeniably much healthier. The harsh reality is that the Ferrari 512S had to be sacrificed for sports car racing to live. This is where it gets really interesting, specifically regarding the physical cars that survived that unhinged era. Because while they were essentially regulated into worthless, obsolete scrap metal back in 1972, the modern collector market has a very funny way of correcting historical injustices. Of the 25 original chassis that Ferrari meticulously assembled to satisfy the FIA, automotive historians estimate that perhaps 18 of them still survive today in various states of originality. When one of these surviving examples actually comes up for public auction or private sale, which, by the way, is incredibly rare because mega collectors absolutely hoard them, prices easily exceed $10 million. And if you happen to find an exceptional, highly original example with significant documented race history, you are looking at a price tag well north of $15 million. That is a pretty astronomical return on investment for a piece of machinery that the factory teams couldn't even give away to privateers after the rule change. And here is the irony of all ironies. The 512S still lives on today in the modern vintage racing scene. But even there, more than half a century later, it is almost entirely too much car for the grid. Event organizers at prestigious historic races like the Goodwood Revival or the Le Mans Classic frequently don't know what to do with them. They often have to place the 512S in completely separate, isolated run groups. Why? Because they are still so violently faster than the other period-correct machinery that it creates a massive safety hazard. It is the exact same problem from 1970, playing out all over again in the modern era. The 512S is simply too incredibly good to play nicely with others. The current billionaire owners report that driving one at actual racing speeds is an intoxicating mix of absolute thrill and paralyzing terror. The performance envelope is so ridiculously broad, and the capabilities of the chassis are so extreme that even highly experienced modern professional racing drivers struggle to extract its full, terrifying potential without modern traction control or ABS to save them. The legacy of the 512S didn't just end on the historic racing circuit either. The technologies developed in that frantic, unhinged crucible of unlimited budget development filtered directly down through Ferrari's legendary road cars for decades to come. Take the engine architecture, for example. That glorious flat 12 engine that would go on to power iconic 1980s bedroom poster supercars like the Berlinetta Boxer and the legendary Ferrari Testarossa. That architecture is a direct bloodline descendant of the volumetric efficiency and thermodynamics knowledge gained from the 512S racing program. They didn't have to start from a blank sheet of paper. The 512S had already done the heavy lifting. The complex aerodynamic principles that Ferrari's engineers learned from shaping those extreme, wind-cheating long-tail bodies heavily influenced the design language and the functional downforce of virtually every single Ferrari sports car that followed. Even today, if you look at the current Le Mans winning Ferrari 499P hypercar program, the lead engineers openly reference the packaging efficiency and the radical cooling solutions that were pioneered on the 512S. It was literally 50 years ahead of its time. Furthermore, the FIA's ruthless ban permanently changed how international racing was regulated forever. the governing body learned a very hard, very expensive lesson. Simple engine displacement limits were never going to be enough to stop brilliant engineers backed by unlimited budgets. They realized they needed comprehensive, hyper-detailed regulations, minimum weight limits, maximum fuel tank capacities, strict dimensional boxes for aerodynamic elements. Those modern technical rulebooks that are hundreds of pages long and dictate every single millimeter of a modern Formula One or WEC car, they exist almost entirely because the 512S proved that given enough freedom, engineers will always build machines that transcend the intended boundaries of the sport itself. In the story of the 512S endurance, it isn't just a tale of speed. It's the ultimate cautionary tale about the terrifying pursuit of absolute perfection. Look, Ferrari built the absolute pinnacle of an endurance racing car, a machine that pushed every conceivable physical boundary and completely shattered every established convention of what a vehicle could endure. They succeeded so completely, so totally, that the entire global sport had to be fundamentally restructured just to contain the sheer magnitude of their own creation. It remains the only major racing car in history that was essentially banned not for what it did wrong, but for what it did entirely too right. In the end, the Ferrari 512S represents a uniquely fleeting moment in motorsport history. It was a time when highly ambitious engineers were given completely unlimited freedom to pursue ultimate speed, when technical regulations were viewed as polite suggestions rather than strict legal restrictions, and when the only true limits were human imagination and the depth of a corporate budget. The car stands today as a towering, aggressive monument to what is actually possible when all of those artificial constraints are permanently removed. But it is also a sobering reminder of exactly why those strict constraints exist in the first place. The 512S definitively proved that in racing, just as in life, there actually can be too much of a good thing. It was entirely too fast. It was astronomically too expensive. It was mechanically too dominant. It pushed the performance envelope so incredibly far that the envelope completely tore open. The international racing world looked at what Enzo Ferrari and his army of engineers had created and collectively decided with genuine fear that this specific path led absolutely nowhere good. The ban wasn't just about slowing the cars down for the sake of lap times, it was about literally saving the sport of endurance racing from eating itself alive. Now, you might be thinking, but wouldn't the sport have eventually adapted? Wouldn't the tracks have evolved to handle the speed? Here's what most people don't realize. The physical infrastructure of the 1970s was completely incapable of keeping up with the rapid pace of automotive aerospace development. Think of it like trying to land a modern supersonic fighter jet on a dirt runway built for crop dusters. The tracks were lined with simple hay bales, flimsy guardrails, and completely unprotected trees. You cannot simply rebuild every historic circuit in Europe overnight to accommodate cars that are suddenly doing 230 miles per hour in the middle of a rainy night. Think about the sheer logistics of what they were attempting to do with this vehicle. They were taking an experimental aerospace-grade missile, stripping away any semblance of modern driver safety, and launching it down narrow country lanes that were originally paved for horse-drawn carriages. The physical toll on the drivers was completely unprecedented. These men were subjected to brutal, bone-rattling vibrations, deafening engine noise that caused permanent hearing damage, and searing cockpit temperatures that routinely exceeded 140 degrees Fahrenheit. They were completely dehydrated, physically exhausted, and mentally drained, yet they were still expected to thread the needle through slower traffic at speeds that would make a modern driver hesitate. It was a completely unsustainable model of competitive operation. The cars had drastically outgrown their own environment, and the human beings driving them had reached the absolute maximum processing speed of the fragile human brain. Every single time I see a surviving 512S in person today, whether it is resting silently at a high-end museum or screaming down the straightaway at a vintage racing event, I am immediately struck by the exact same thought. This machine isn't just a classic racing car.
It is a terrifying, beautiful time capsule from an unhinged era when literally anything felt possible. It represents a time when engineers were limited only by the rigid laws of physics and the bottomless funding of major automotive empires. It represents the absolute zenith of completely unlimited racing car development.
This is where it gets really interesting, though. We will absolutely never see anything remotely like it ever again. The modern regulations simply won't allow that level of unchecked freedom. The modern corporate costs would be entirely prohibitive for any board of directors to approve. The legal and physical risks to the drivers and the spectators would be completely unacceptable in today's highly litigious society. Modern racing is incredible. It is undeniably much safer, and it is vastly more competitive from top to bottom. But it is also highly sanitized. It is completely managed. It is engineered to a specific, highly controlled formula to ensure a predictable entertainment product. But for one brief, incredibly glorious and highly dangerous moment in 1970 and 1971, the Ferrari 512S showed the entire world exactly what happens when you tell a group of passionate Italian engineers to simply build the fastest, most capable endurance racing car physically possible, and let the historical consequences be completely damned. They created a mechanical monster so profoundly beautiful, so violently capable, and so utterly overwhelming that the rest of the world had to literally rewrite the international rulebook just to stop it from conquering everything. And you know what? That is not a failure. That is not a defeat. That is the ultimate absolute victory in the history of motorsport. What is the most absolutely dominant racing car that you truly think was completely and unfairly banned or heavily regulated out of existence by deeply scared racing officials? Please let me know your honest thoughts right down in the comments section below. And if you want more deep, compelling dives into the untold historical stories about legendary racing machines that were quite simply too good for their own survival, make sure to hit that subscribe button today. Until next time, keep those racing engines screaming loud.